There are moments in life when a feeling arrives quietly, without warning or permission, slipping through the cracks of the defenses you spent years building. At first, you barely notice it. It feels like a soft pull, a small warmth, something easy to ignore. But then something inside you shifts. A part of you that you thought you had buried begins to wake up again. You find yourself looking at someone not because you planned to, but because something within you is drawn there. And in that instant, you realize you are standing in front of a door you promised yourself you would never open again. The door of longing, vulnerability, and connection. The door you once closed after life taught you that depending on others can end in disappointment. When an avoidant heart meets someone they cannot fully have, that moment becomes even more intense. Because what they feel is not just attraction or simple desire, it is recognition. It feels like meeting someone who reflects parts of you that have never been seen or touched before. And the more out of reach that person becomes, the stronger the pull grows. What makes it unbearable is not just wanting them, but knowing you cannot reach them. In that space, all the emotional walls, all the discipline, all the carefully maintained distance begin to shake. You don't consciously choose this kind of love. It arrives on its own, and once it does, nothing inside you stays the same. For someone with an avoidant nature, love like this creates an internal rupture long before anything happens on the outside. They have spent most of their life learning how to stay self-contained, how to move through the world without needing anyone too deeply. Closeness has always felt unsafe, unpredictable, something that threatens their control. So they build a quiet inner world based on independence and emotional distance. But when feelings enter for someone they cannot reach, that entire structure begins to crack. Not because the other person did anything wrong, but because love itself starts exposing everything they worked so hard to keep hidden. This kind of longing is different for them. Most people can share it, speak about it, or find comfort in it. But for an avoidant person, it feels unfamiliar and intrusive, like something that does not belong. It stirs emotions they usually keep buried. Suddenly they feel the need for closeness, attention, and reassurance. And that need feels like a contradiction to the identity they built around being emotionally independent. The conflict becomes internal. Their mind tells them to step back, stay controlled, stay detached, like always. But their emotions move in the opposite direction. The more unavailable the person is, the more intense the feeling becomes. It grows in silence, in imagination, in moments they cannot control. They start replaying conversations, picturing closeness, feeling emotions they rarely allow themselves to feel. The armor they built over years starts to feel tight and heavy because something inside them is pushing against it, trying to breathe again. What they discover in this process is not just desire for another person, but a deeper truth about themselves. That they are not as emotionally distant as they believed. That they do crave connection, even if they learn to deny it. Love in this form becomes a mirror. It shows them that avoidance did not erase their need for intimacy. It only numbed it. And when that realization arrives, it is quiet but powerful. Because the feeling they cannot act on continues to exist anyway. It lives in thoughts, in silence, in imagination, and in emotional spaces they cannot shut down. The unattainable person becomes a catalyst, not just for desire, but for awakening. They begin to see parts of themselves they abandoned long ago, softness, hope, and the need to be understood. This internal experience can feel overwhelming because it challenges everything they believed about themselves. The idea that they function best alone no longer feels completely true. For the first time, connection does not feel like danger alone, but also like something meaningful they have been missing. And even if they do not act on it, the feeling changes them. Because once they have seen that depth within themselves, they cannot fully return to who they were before. They start to feel comforting, but that comfort itself becomes unsettling, Because it quietly points toward dependency. And dependency is exactly what they have spent their entire life trying to avoid. Ironically, it is the fact that this love cannot be fully lived or completed that allows these hidden emotions to rise without immediate fear. Since there is no real possibility of possession, there is also no direct risk of loss, no clear rejection, and no face-to-face emotional consequence. That distance creates a strange sense of safety where the avoidant can feel more deeply than usual without having to deal with the outcomes. This creates a contradiction within them. The love hurts because it is out of reach, yet at the same time it softens something inside them, because it brings feelings they had long forgotten. The unattainable person slowly becomes a kind of emotional doorway, through which they reconnect with parts of themselves that were buried under protection, fear, and control. What they are really longing for is not only the person, but the emotional version of themselves that once existed before they learned to shut things down. Their inner world begins to speak again in a language they had muted for years, a language made of need, closeness, and emotional presence. Even without any possibility of action, the experience reveals a truth they can no longer ignore. Their emotional needs never disappeared. They were only pushed into silence. This becomes a major inner shift. They start to realize that no matter how much distance they create, their capacity to feel has not gone anywhere. Loving someone they cannot have becomes an unexpected way of rediscovering emotional depth they thought they had outgrown. At the same time, something else begins to happen. The usual escape patterns that once protected them no longer work the same way. Their entire emotional strategy has always depended on stepping back whenever things feel too intense, too close, or too vulnerable. Distance has always been their solution, their way of regaining control. In most situations, withdrawing would reduce the emotional pressure and bring relief. But with this kind of attachment, that relief never comes. They can step away physically, but the feeling remains. They can stay silent, but the connection still lives inside their mind. They can distract themselves, but the emotional pull continues underneath everything. There is no clear situation to fix, no person to confront, no relationship to exit. The experience exists entirely within them, which creates a kind of emotional trap they are not used to facing. This is where the real conflict begins. They are unable to move forward, but also unable to fully let go. The feeling becomes something like an echo that follows them internally, breaking the illusion that distance always equals control. Avoidance only works when escape is possible. When escape stops working, they are left alone with the very emotions they have built their life around avoiding. Instead of bringing calm, silence starts to amplify what they feel. Instead of reducing intensity, distance makes it louder. Every attempt to suppress it only deepens the emotional presence of it, because what they are feeling has no external outlet and nowhere to go. It remains suspended inside them, growing quietly over time. This forces them inward in a way they are not familiar with. They begin to question why this feeling persists, why it feels so strong, and why this particular person seems to awaken something they thought they had already shut down. Because there is nothing external to do, the experience becomes internal by necessity. They are pushed into reflection whether they want it or not. In that inward space, patterns they normally avoid start to surface. The need for closeness, the desire to be understood, the fear of being emotionally exposed, and the sadness of never fully allowing intimacy into their life begin to appear more clearly. The unattainable connection does not speak through interaction, but through emotional resonance. It reflects back what they feel, but have never fully expressed. Their internal world becomes more active, more honest, and harder to ignore. They are left facing emotional truths they usually keep buried. The strange part is that the impossibility of the situation is what creates this opening. Because they cannot reach outward, they are forced to turn inward. What they experience becomes a kind of emotional exposure. It removes the comfort of avoidance and brings attention to what has been hidden beneath it. The distance that once felt like protection becomes the very thing that reveals them to themselves. It doesn't respond to them in predictable ways. It doesn't give reassurance they can easily push away. And it doesn't allow them to control how fast or how slowly the emotions unfold. Instead, it quietly exposes everything they have tried to keep hidden, even from themselves. The unattainable person slowly becomes more than just someone they are drawn to. They turn into a symbolic presence, carrying meaning far beyond the actual relationship. Through this connection, the avoidant begins to feel a deeper pull, and that pull shines a light on emotional needs they have long avoided acknowledging. They start noticing how strong their need for closeness really is, even if they have spent years acting like it doesn't exist. At the same time, this feeling does not come out of nowhere. It connects back to older emotional experiences stored within them. Moments when they needed support but didn't receive it. Moments when being vulnerable felt unsafe. Moments when closeness felt like something that could lead to loss or pain. Without realizing it, this present attachment starts touching those older layers, bringing them back to the surface. What makes this experience so intense is that it does not express itself loudly. It doesn't explode outward. Instead, it builds quietly, like a steady emotional pressure they can't ignore. They begin to question why this specific person affects them so deeply, why the feeling feels stronger than expected, and why it lingers, even when there is no clear path forward. Slowly, they begin to understand that it is not only about the person in front of them. It is also about what this situation awakens within them. The unreachable connection becomes a symbol of every emotional distance they have experienced before. Every time they felt unchosen, unseen, or unsafe in closeness gets stirred again through this present longing. Because the connection cannot be acted on, their usual coping strategies stop working. They cannot push it away through distance, they cannot resolve it through control, and they cannot escape it by changing the situation. Nothing external changes, so everything begins to happen internally. And in that inner space, every emotion becomes louder, more visible, and harder to avoid. This is where they begin to see parts of themselves they have ignored for a long time. The desire for emotional safety, the fear of being too open, and the quiet sadness of never fully allowing themselves to need someone all start to surface. The unattainable person doesn't heal these wounds, but they reflect them with clarity, making it impossible to unsee. In that sense, the other person becomes a kind of emotional mirror. They start to represent something deeper than themselves. Warmth, acceptance, emotional safety, or a version of love that feels gentle and secure. But what the avoidant is really responding to is not just the individual. It is the meaning their mind attaches to them. Through this process, they begin to see their own contradictions more clearly. The pull toward intimacy exists at the same time as the instinct to withdraw from it. The desire for closeness exists alongside the fear of being hurt by it. And underneath it all, older beliefs begin to surface. The idea that needing others is weakness, that closeness leads to loss, and that independence is the only safe way to exist. The unattainable love does not erase these beliefs, but it exposes them. It brings awareness to patterns that were previously automatic and unconscious. It shows the difference between the identity they present to the world and the emotional reality they carry inside. When an avoidant falls for someone they cannot have, the experience eventually becomes more than emotional discomfort. It becomes a turning point. Their usual sense of control begins to weaken. The familiar strategy of stepping back no longer creates relief. Instead, the feelings remain present, no matter how much they try to suppress them. This creates an internal shift. They find themselves thinking more deeply, reflecting more often, and feeling in ways that feel unfamiliar. The emotional walls they relied on start to feel less stable, and the inner structure they built around distance begins to loosen. This is also where awareness starts to grow. They begin questioning why closeness feels so threatening. why they pull away when something matters, and why emotional connection feels both wanted and dangerous at the same time. Even if there are no immediate answers, the act of questioning itself changes something within them. Old emotional layers begin to surface more clearly. Feelings of abandonment, unmet needs, and long-held fears of dependency slowly rise into awareness. For the first time, they are not escaping them because there is nowhere to escape to. The experience is happening inside them, and it keeps them present with what they usually avoid. In that space, something begins to shift. They start recognizing that vulnerability does not destroy them the way they once believed. Instead, it reveals what has always been there beneath the emotional distance. Their capacity to feel, to care, and to form connection becomes harder to deny. Even though the person remains unattainable, the internal transformation continues. The experience leaves a lasting imprint. It changes how they understand love, how they see themselves, and how they relate to emotional closeness. Over time, they begin to realize that their need for control has also been their limitation. What once felt like protection has also kept them from depth, intimacy, and emotional richness. And while this realization does not instantly change them, it marks the beginning of a different awareness. They cannot fully return to who they were before because something inside them has already opened. Humility, not humiliation, but a quiet, grounded awareness of being human in ways they once tried to deny. They begin to see that needing someone is not a weakness, longing for connection is not a flaw, and being emotionally moved by another person is not a failure of control or stability. Instead, it is proof that they are capable of depth they had kept hidden even from themselves. The love they cannot have gently disrupts the identity built around independence and emotional self-sufficiency. It shows them that their internal structure was never truly unbreakable. It was only quiet, controlled, and dormant. And now, something inside it has started to awaken. This experience does not make them fragile, it makes them real. They start learning that emotions cannot simply be shut down by distance or discipline. The longing they feel becomes a kind of silent teacher, revealing that the very defenses meant to protect them from disappointment have also limited their ability to experience connection in its fullest form. Through this unattainable love, they begin to recognize their own boundaries more clearly. They see why closeness feels intimidating, why vulnerability triggers resistance, and why intimacy can feel like stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. The discomfort is real, but within it sits understanding. It teaches them that emotional dependency is not a defect, it is part of being human, something they have simply spent too long avoiding. As they sit with this ache, something softens. They start to accept that they do want closeness. They do want connection. They do want to be seen, understood, and emotionally met. And instead of judging these needs, they begin to acknowledge them without shame. This alone marks a shift, because for most of their life, emotions were something to move past quickly, to suppress before they grew too loud. But now, because this love cannot be acted upon, they are forced to stay with what they feel instead of escaping it. In that stillness, they begin to realize that healing is not about removing emotion, but allowing it to exist without resistance, letting it move through them without fear or judgment. For the first time, they witness what it means to simply feel without shutting down. And in that space, something changes. Love stops appearing as possession, control, or certainty. It becomes something quieter and more honest, a presence that reveals itself most clearly when nothing is forced and nothing is demanded. Loving someone they cannot have teaches them that connection is not defined by outcome. It is defined by the depth of feeling that is awakened within them. What matters is not whether the bond is completed, but what it brings to the surface inside their emotional world. This understanding softens them in a lasting way. It shifts their perception of love from something risky and unstable into something reflective, something that shows them who they are beneath their defenses. Vulnerability begins to feel less like a threat and more like a form of truth. Longing no longer represents lack alone, it also reveals capacity. The unattainable nature of the connection becomes a turning point. It shows them that the emotional richness they were searching for in another person was already beginning to grow within them. That person was not the source of their depth, but the spark that revealed it. What truly changes is internal. The experience uncovers sensitivity, emotional awareness, and a depth of feeling they had kept buried under control and protection. It opens a space inside them that had long been closed off by fear and old emotional wounds. And in that space, they begin to meet themselves more honestly than ever before. Not the version shaped by distance and control, but the one beneath it, the one capable of feeling fully, even if quietly. This passage is describing a quiet, internal transformation that happens when someone who is emotionally avoidant falls for a person they cannot actually have. It is not about external action or dramatic change, but about what slowly shifts inside their emotional world. At first, the unattainable love does not feel like something destructive. Instead, it feels subtle and deeply internal. It doesn't force them to break their patterns suddenly or painfully. Rather, it slowly changes how those patterns feel. The emotional defenses they once relied on, distance, control, self-protection, starts to lose their original purpose. What used to feel like safety begins to feel more like restriction. In other words, the same walls that once protected them from emotional pain begin to feel like they are also blocking emotional life itself. Instead of feeling secure, they start to feel emotionally confined. This shift is important because it marks the beginning of awareness. They are no longer just protecting themselves, they are also limiting themselves. As this realization grows, they begin to understand something they had not fully accepted before. They are still capable of love. They are still capable of emotional depth, connection, and genuine feeling, even if they spent years believing otherwise or acting as if they didn't need it. The experience quietly contradicts the identity they built around emotional independence. Another key idea is that they cannot fully control what they feel. Avoidant people often rely on emotional control as a survival strategy. They try to regulate distance, intensity, and attachment so nothing becomes overwhelming. But this experience shows them that emotions don't follow strict rules. The heart doesn't behave like a system that can be managed. It moves on its own logic, often outside of awareness or control. When that realization finally becomes clear, it changes how they see themselves. They begin to understand that they are not as emotionally shut down as they believed. The feelings they experience prove that connection still matters deeply to them, even if they have avoided it for a long time. Even if the relationship never becomes real or mutual, something still remains with them. The experience leaves behind a kind of emotional residue, greater awareness, softer self-understanding, and a more honest relationship with their own feelings. Nothing external changes, but internally they become more aware of who they are emotionally. The heartbreak itself becomes a turning point. It is not just pain, but a threshold they cross internally. On one side of it is their old way of living, controlled, distant, guarded. On the other side is something new, awareness. Not instant transformation, but the beginning of it. After going through this, they start to see themselves differently. They realize that love did not destroy them or expose a weakness in them. Instead, it revealed something that was already there, their capacity to feel, to care, and to connect. The emotional experience brings this truth into focus. In the end, the passage suggests a quiet but powerful shift. They begin to move from fear of closeness toward understanding it, from denying emotional depth toward recognizing it, and from seeing vulnerability as danger toward seeing it as part of being human.